The Renaissance was a cultural and intellectual movement that began in Italy during the 14th century and gradually spread across Europe, lasting until the 17th century. It resulted in a period of rebirth in art, literature, science, and philosophy, following the stagnation of the Middle Ages. The movement was sparked by renewed interest in the classical knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome, much of which had been presented by Islamic scholars and rediscovered through trade, travel, and the Crusades. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 also played a role, as many Greek scholars fled to Italy, bringing classical texts and ideas with them. During the Renaissance, humanism became a central philosophy, emphasizing the value of human potential and achievements. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael revolutionized visual art with techniques like perspective, anatomy, and naturalism. In literature, figures such as Dante, Petrarch, and later Shakespeare explored complex human emotions and themes. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century allowed ideas to spread more rapidly than ever before, contributing to an explosion of learning and literacy. The movement lasted roughly 3 centuries, from the 1300s to the 1600s, and its influence touched nearly every aspect of European life. It laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution, with it also affecting politics, education, and religion, eventually helping to shape the modern Western worldview. The outcomes of the Renaissance were profound, leading to a transformation in the way people viewed themselves in the world. It helped transition Europe from the medieval period to the modern age and left a legacy on art, science, culture, and human thought. The Protestant Reformation was a major religious movement that began in the early 16th century and significantly reshaped the religious and political landscape of Europe. It officially started in 1517 when Martin Luther, a German monk and theologian, published his 95 Theses, which criticized the Roman Catholic Church's sale of indulgences and called for reforms. The movement arose due to widespread dissatisfaction with church corruption, the growing influence on humanist ideas from the Renaissance, and increasing calls for a return to biblical authority and a more personal relationship with God. The Reformation rapidly gained momentum across Europe, specifically in regions like Germany, Switzerland, and England. In England, the Reformation took a political turn when King Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England in the 1530s. These events led to the formation of various Protestant denominations, such as Lutheranism. The movement continued for over a century, triggering religious wars, social disruption, and political changes. It culminated in events such as the 30 Years' War in 1618 and the Peace of Westphalia, which allowed rulers to choose their state's religion and recognized Protestantism as a legitimate branch of Christianity. The Catholic Church also responded with its own Counter-Reformation, seeking to reform itself and reaffirm its doctrines. The Protestant Reformation was deeply impactful because it challenged the religious unity of Europe, weakened the power of the Catholic Church, and encouraged greater literacy and personal interpretation of Scripture. The Scientific Revolution was a transformative period in European history that began in the mid-16th century and lasted through the 18th century. It resulted in a fundamental shift in the way people understood the natural world, moving away from traditional beliefs rooted in religious and ancient authorities toward a new emphasis on observation, experimentation, and reason. The movement emerged partly as a result of the intellectual curiosity inspired by the Renaissance and the questioning spirit of the Protestant Reformation. As scholars revisited ancient texts and made new discoveries, they began to challenge long-standing views about the cosmos, biology, and physics. The revolution began with key figures such as Nicholas Copernicus, who in the 1540s proposed a heliocentric model of the universe, placing the sun rather than the earth at the center. This idea directly contradicted the church-supported geocentric model and set the stage for further questioning. Later, scientists like Galileo Galilei used telescopes to observe celestial bodies, confirming Copernican theories and promoting the idea that nature could be studied through empirical evidence. Johannes Kepler advanced this work by describing planetary motion in mathematical terms, and Isaac Newton later unified many of these ideas in his laws of motion and universal gravitation. The scientific revolution lasted from roughly 1543, when Copernicus published his major work, to the late 1600s and early 1700s, when Newton's ideas became widely accepted. During this time, the scientific method was developed as a systematic way of understanding the world, relying on observation, hypothesis, experimentation, and analysis. The scientific revolution laid the intellectual foundation for the Enlightenment, advanced technology, and drastically changed how humans view the universe and their place within it. The Enlightenment was an intellectual and cultural movement that emerged in Europe during the late 17th century and reached its height in the 18th century. It was driven by the belief that reason, logic, and scientific inquiry could be used to improve society, government, and human life. The movement arose in the wake of the scientific revolution, which had demonstrated that observation and rational thought could uncover natural laws. Enlightenment thinkers applied these same principles to social, political, and economic issues, challenging traditional authority and promoting ideas such as liberty, equality, and justice. Key figures of the Enlightenment included John Locke, who argued for natural rights and the idea that governments could serve the people; Voltaire, who criticized religious intolerance and supported freedom of speech; Montesquieu, who advocated for separation of powers in government; and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who emphasized the social contract and popular sovereignty. In addition to politics and philosophy, Enlightenment ideals influenced education, economics, religion, and the arts. The Enlightenment was so impactful because it encouraged people to question long-standing institutions such as absolute monarchy in the church, leading to major political and social changes. The movement inspired both the American Revolution in 1776 and the French Revolution in 1789, as people demanded governments based on democratic principles and individual rights. The Enlightenment laid the groundwork for modern democracies, legal systems, and human rights. It also helped foster a culture that values critical thinking, scientific inquiry, and personal freedom. Abolitionism was a powerful social and political campaign aimed at ending slavery and the slave trade, most notably in the United States and Europe. It began in the late 18th century and gained significant momentum throughout the 19th century. The movement arose out of growing moral, religious, and philosophical opposition to slavery, specifically from Enlightenment thinkers and Christian reformers, who believed that all human beings were entitled to freedom and dignity. Early efforts included Quaker-led petitions and writings that denounced slavery as both a sin and a violation of natural rights. The movement expanded in the early 1800s with the rise of activists, writers, and speakers who called for the immediate end of slavery. Abolitionists in the United States, such as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and more, used speeches, books, newspapers, and the Underground Railroad to expose the cruelty of slavery and help enslaved people escape. In Britain, leaders like William Wilberforce helped pass laws that eventually led to the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833. The American abolitionist movement intensified in the decades leading up to the Civil War. Tensions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery states led to deep national divisions. The movement lasted until 1865, when the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution formally abolished slavery nationwide. Abolitionism played a crucial role in reshaping ideas about human rights, equality, and justice. It also paved the way for later civil rights movements and helped redefine the moral responsibilities of governments and citizens. While it faced resistance, the movement ultimately succeeded in ending one of history's most brutal institutions. Feminism is a broad social and political campaign aimed at achieving equality between the sexes. It began in the late 18th century, when early thinkers, like Mary Wollstonecraft, argued for women's education and equal treatment. The movement gained strength in the 19th century, with the rise of the first wave of feminism, which focused primarily on legal issues such as women's suffrage, property rights, and access to education. This wave culminated in major victories like the right to vote in countries such as the United States and United Kingdom in the 1920s. The second wave emerged in the 1960s and continued into the 1980s, expanding the fight to include social and cultural inequalities. Activists during this period addressed issues such as workplace discrimination, reproductive rights, domestic violence, and legal inequalities. Feminism became a global movement, inspiring similar efforts in countries around the world. A third wave emerged in the 1990s, emphasizing individuality and inclusivity, recognizing that race, class, and sexuality also shape women's experiences. A fourth wave, beginning in the 2010s, has used digital platforms to combat harassment, promote empowerment, and continue the push for gender equality. Feminism has transformed laws, expanded opportunities for women, and changed cultural expectations. It has challenged traditional power structures and opened conversations about identity, justice, and equality. The Industrial Revolution was a major turning point in human history that began in Great Britain in the late 18th century and continued into the 19th century. It resulted in the shift from agrarian, handcraft-based economies to industrialized and machine-driven production. This movement began around the 1760s due to a combination of factors, including access to natural resources like coal and iron, political stability, a strong banking system, and technological innovation. The Agricultural Revolution had also increased food supply and population, creating more labor and demand for goods. During the Industrial Revolution, groundbreaking inventions such as the spinning jenny, the steam engine, and the power loom revolutionized textile production and transportation. Factories became very important for production, moving work from rural homes into urban centers. As a result, cities grew rapidly and new industrial cities emerged. Transportation was transformed through the construction of canals, railroads, and improved road networks, which allowed goods to be moved faster and more efficiently than ever before. The movement lasted from roughly the 1760s to the mid-1800s, with later phases continuing into the early 20th century. It spread from Britain to the rest of Europe, North America, and eventually the world. The Industrial Revolution greatly increased production and wealth, leading to the rise of a powerful middle class in the modern capitalist economy. However, it also caused widespread social changes, including poor working conditions, child labor, and overcrowded cities. The outcomes of the Industrial Revolution were both positive and negative, with it reshaping human society more drastically than almost any period before it. The labor movement was a social and political campaign aimed at improving the conditions, rights, and power of workers. It began during the Industrial Revolution, when rapid industrialization led to long working hours, low wages, unsafe workplaces, and the exploitation of men, women, and children. As factory work replaced traditional labor, workers found themselves with little to no protections or bargaining power. In response, laborers began organizing to demand better treatment, leading to the rise of trade unions and collective action. The movement gained strength throughout the 1800s and into the 20th century, specifically in industrialized nations such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany. Workers held strikes, formed labor unions, and lobbied governments for laws that would protect their rights. Key goals included the 8-hour workday, fair wages, safer working environments, and the right to organize without employer retaliation. The labor movement continued well into the 20th century, with major successes during the New Deal era in the 1930s, when the US government passed laws like the Wagner Act, which protected union activity. In many countries, the movement led to the establishment of minimum wage laws, workplace safety regulations, and social welfare programs such as unemployment insurance and pensions. The labor movement helped humanize industrial economies, giving workers a voice. The Indian independence movement was a prolonged and powerful struggle against British colonial rule that ultimately led to the creation of an independent India in 1947. The movement began in the mid-19th century, gaining momentum after the Indian Rebellion of 1857, which, although unsuccessful, resulted in the beginning of organized resistance to British control. British rule brought economic exploitation, cultural suppression, and political disenfranchisement, fueling widespread dissatisfaction across Indian society. Over time, this discontent evolved into a unified call for self-rule. In the late 1800s, the formation of the Indian National Congress provided a political platform for Indians to demand greater autonomy. Early efforts focused on reform within the British system, but by the early 20th century, the movement had shifted toward full independence. Key leaders, such as Mahatma Gandhi, played important roles. Gandhi's influence of nonviolent resistance became a fundamental aspect of this movement, drawing in global attention to India's cause. The movement lasted for nearly a century, from the 1850s to 1947. It included various approaches, from peaceful protest and boycotts to more radical movements. World War II also weakened Britain's ability to maintain its empire, and growing international pressure contributed to the decision to grant India independence. The outcome of the movement was the end of nearly 200 years of British colonial rule. On August 15, 1947, India became an independent nation. However, independence came with the partition of India and Pakistan, leading to widespread violence and displacement. Despite these challenges, the Indian independence movement stands as one of the most significant non-violent struggles in world history, inspiring decolonization efforts across the globe. The civil rights movement was an important era in American history that spanned primarily from the mid-1950s through the late 1960s. It began as a response to the deeply rooted system of racial segregation and discrimination that African Americans faced, specifically in the southern United States. Despite the end of slavery following the Civil War, African Americans continued to experience systemic inequality through Jim Crow laws, disenfranchisement, and racial violence. The movement gained national attention in 1955 when Roosevelt Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama. Her arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, led by a young Martin Luther King Jr., which resulted in a major turning point in the fight for civil rights. Throughout the movement, activists employed nonviolent protest and civil disobedience to challenge segregation and injustice. Sit-ins, freedom rides, marches, and legal battles were common strategies used to confront discriminatory practices. Major events, such as the 1953 March on Washington, where Dr. King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, helped bring in public support and pressure the federal government to act. The civil rights movement resulted in significant legal and social changes. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed segregation in public places and eliminated many barriers to African American voting rights. Although the movement is generally considered to have ended in the late 1960s, its legacy continues to shape ongoing struggles for racial justice. The anti-apartheid movement was a global campaign that opposed the system of apartheid in South Africa, a policy of racial segregation and white minority rule, officially implemented in 1948 by the National Party. This movement began during the 1950s and 1960s, as black South Africans and their allies sought to resist oppressive laws that denied basic rights, freedom, and citizenship to the non-white majority. Apartheid legally separated people by race, restricting where they could live, work, go to school, and even whom they could marry. The African National Congress, led by figures like Nelson Mandela, became central to the resistance, initially using nonviolent protest before turning to armed struggle after peaceful methods were brutally suppressed. The movement gained international momentum in the 1960s and 70s, especially after Mandela's imprisonment in 1962 and the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, where police killed 69 unarmed protesters. These events drew global condemnation and inspired anti-apartheid activism around the world. Organizations, students, and governments outside South Africa began imposing economic sanctions, cultural boycotts, and divestment campaigns to pressure the South African government. The anti-apartheid movement lasted for nearly 5 decades, with resistance growing stronger into the 1980s. It culminated in the early 1990s, when internal unrest and external pressure forced the South African government to dismantle apartheid laws. Nelson Mandela was released in 1990, and in 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election, electing Mandela as president. The impact of the anti-apartheid movement was profound, not only in ending institutionalized racism in South Africa, but also in inspiring global activism against oppression. The human rights movement is a global effort aimed at securing and protecting fundamental rights and freedoms for all individuals, regardless of race, gender, nationality, or other status. While the concept of human rights has existed for centuries, the modern human rights movement began after World War II, in response to the atrocities committed during the Holocaust and the war. In 1948, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which outlined a broad range of civil, political, economic, and social rights. This document served as a foundation for the movement and inspired efforts to ensure that governments worldwide uphold these policies. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, the human rights movement gained momentum as organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others emerged to document abuses and advocate for victims. The movement expanded rapidly in the 1960s and 70s, addressing issues such as political imprisonment, torture, freedom of speech, and the rights of women and minorities. It played a major role in influencing international law and institutions, pushing for the creation of human rights courts and treaties aimed at holding violators accountable. The human rights movement has been impactful because it established the idea that human dignity and equality are not just ideals, but legal and moral obligations. While not all goals have been achieved and human rights violations persist, the movement has succeeded in raising awareness, shaping global norms, and pressuring governments to improve their records. The LGBTQ+ rights movement is a social and political movement that advocates for equal rights and societal acceptance for individuals of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. While efforts to support LGBTQ individuals can be traced back to the early 20th century, the modern movement began during the mid-20th century. A key turning point occurred in 1969, with the Stonewall Uprising in New York City, when members of the LGBTQ community resisted a police raid at the Stonewall Inn. This act of defiance sparked widespread activism and is often seen as the birth of the modern LGBTQ rights movement. The movement gained momentum in the 1970s and 80s, with the formation of advocacy organizations, pride marches, and legal challenges to discriminatory laws. During the 1980s and 90s, The LGBTQ community faced significant challenges, specifically due to the AIDS crisis, which led to stigma but also focused on healthcare awareness and government accountability. Over time, the movement expanded to address a broad range of issues, including marriage equality, anti-discrimination protections, transgender rights, and more. Although the movement has evolved over several decades and continues to this day, major milestones have been achieved. In the United States, same-sex marriage was legalized nationwide in 2015. Many countries around the world have since followed with similar legislation. The LGBTQ+ rights movement has been impactful because it challenges long-standing norms, changed public perceptions, and reshaped laws to affirm the rights of LGBTQ people. While discrimination and violence still persist in many places, the movement has created immense change and continues to fight for a world in which all people can live freely without fear of persecution. The environmental movement is a global social and political movement aimed at protecting the natural world and promoting sustainable practices to ensure a healthy planet for future generations. The modern environmental movement began in the 1960s and 70s in response to growing concerns about pollution, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, and the harmful impacts of industrialization. Key events in the movement's early years included the first Earth Day in 1970, leading to the creation of major environmental legislation such as the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and the founding of the Environmental Protection Agency. Activism spread worldwide, with organizations like Greenpeace and the World Wildlife Fund pushing for global environmental protection. The movement addressed a wide range of issues, including endangered species, climate change, toxic waste, and the exploitation of natural resources. The environmental movement has continued for decades, evolving to tackle newer challenges like global warming, plastic pollution, renewable energy, and more. International agreements such as the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement represent major milestones in global cooperation to reduce carbon emissions and combat climate change. This movement has led to important laws and regulations that reduce pollution and protected ecosystems. It also inspired generations to take personal and political action to preserve the environment. The digital revolution occurred when the shift from mechanical technologies to digital systems took place. It began in the late 20th century, around the 1970s, and continues into the present day. This revolution was driven by the invention and widespread adoption of digital computers, microprocessors, and the internet. It fundamentally changed how people communicate, work, learn, and live, making it one of the most impactful technological shifts in human history. The movement started as computers became smaller, more affordable, and more powerful. Innovation such as the personal computer, developed by companies like Apple and IBM, brought computing into homes and offices. In the 1990s, the rise of the internet further accelerated the revolution, enabling global connectivity and the rapid exchange of information. Email, search engines, and later social media platforms transformed communication and access to knowledge. The emergence of smartphones in the 2000s placed powerful computing and internet access into the hands of billions of people. Throughout this period, the digital revolution revolutionized industries, from media and entertainment to finance, education, and healthcare. Traditional jobs were automated, and entirely new careers emerged in tech-related fields. E-commerce changed consumer behavior, while digital tools made remote work and online collaboration possible on a global scale. The impact of the digital revolution is still unfolding. It has increased efficiency, connected people worldwide, and opened up new possibilities for innovation and creativity. However, it has also raised concerns about privacy, cybersecurity, digital inequality, and the future of work. Despite these challenges, the digital revolution has redefined the modern world, making it one of the most significant movements in history due to its influence on nearly every aspect of human life and society. Thank you very much for watching this video, and if you learned something, make sure to leave a like. Comment down below your thoughts on any of the movements I discussed in this video, and subscribe if you would like to see a part 2 or more videos like this one. Thank you again, and goodbye.